The time is now 1984, 2 full years after the end of the Third Great War. To everyone's surprise, the Allies have regained the ability to teleport their units on a small scale, presumably through a reconstructed chronosphere within the London fortress. With regular chronoshift reinforcements, the French rebels took up their fight with renewed vigor and have retaken large parts of the country. Nevertheless, most of France is still occupied by the Soviets, who have been exerting increasing pressure in the country as well. The addition of new equipment such as the catastrophe tank have helped greatly in this regard. Just recently, a joint attack by Russia and the Confederation had pushed the Allied rebels out of the port city of Bordeaux, snatching several Trident battleships away from the Allies. Before they could use it to threaten the safety of the English Channel, however, a reinforcing Allied task force managed to reach the local rebels before they fell, and, with the arrival of US troops from Cannes, successfully liberated Bordeaux and the battleships. In response, the Russians deployed several Stalin's fists near the city outskirts, preparing to initiate full-scale vehicle production for a counterattack. A tank battalion was immediately dispatched by the Allies to thwart this plan, but their initial offensive failed due to flawed intel, which made them underestimate the Soviet presence in the area. To ensure the success of their next attack, the London fortress provided the French rebels with a batch of their newest heavy assault vehicle, the Paladin Tank Hunter. This state-of-the-art unit carries a main cannon packing far more firepower than the standard Cavalier, not to mention its twin missile pods filled with specialized armor-piercing projectiles. Its design seems fully divergent from the traditional Allied doctrines that favor speed and utility, and the Soviet armored forces suddenly found themselves outmatched, as even the Apocalypse tanks, their ultimate expression of armored superiority, had a hard time dealing with the Paladins. Their forces fell quickly, and the precious mobile war factories were summarily destroyed. With similar help from the London fortress, the surviving American forces in the African deserts came out of hiding as well, waging battles against their Soviet arch-rivals once again. Curiously though, the Scorpion Cell did not partake in this battle for dominance, staying just as quiet as they have been for the past 2 years. Their patience is almost unsettling, as if they're planning for something big to come. That's about it in terms of power shifts though. In fact, for what seemed like a daunting task, the Soviets have actually managed to maintain peace and order in their conquered lands quite well. In no small thanks, of course, to the web of lies spun by Yuri in the past 2 years, which made the rest of the world believe Russia still holds more Midas warheads. There was a close call a year ago when a Chinese agent found out the truth, but he was silenced by the Psi Corps before he could deliver the news to his leaders. The former chief advisor's continued devotion to this bluff confused the High Command and Romanov greatly, and their paranoia is further exacerbated by their lack of progress in tracking Yuri down. Still, the lie is about the only thing keeping them in power, and they will play into it if it helps maintain their supremacy. September 1st, 1984. On this momentous day, the second-year anniversary of their glorious triumph over the Allies, the Russians decided to hold a parade in the seat of their power, Moscow, putting their full might on display for all to see. Among them were new additions to their armored divisions, improved weapons for their Tesla troopers, and last but not least, 8 upgraded Topor-M platforms armed with their fearsome Midas warheads. Well, not really, as the platforms merely carried dummies meant to fool the rest of the world. But Moscow is practically a veritable fortress now, so who would even be able to, much less dare, to try to expose this lie? No one. None. Except the Epsilon Army.
Their equipment may interfere with our stealth technology. Shadow 1, nuclear reactor in sight. Shadow 2, in position. Shadow 3, target in range, ready to fire. Shadow 4, likewise.
Let's begin.
Comrade?
We are being attacked!
There was one thing the fortress failed to account for: the enemy unseen. With the oil barrels carefully placed by their agents beforehand, the Epsilon shadow tanks slunk across the roads and simultaneously destroyed all of the nuclear reactors in Moscow, plunging the city into complete disarray. Answering the clarion call, numerous drillers surfaced at once, unleashing a tide of fury upon the parade. Many Soviet forces perished before their minds could even register what had transpired, struck down in their hour of glory, at their most vulnerable. More and more Psi Corps and Scorpion Cell forces poured in from outside the city as well, accompanied by their very own mobile construction vehicles. Within minutes, the Russians brought their backup generators online, restoring their power and a degree of battlefield intelligence. Counterattacks organized by the High Command immediately began, desperately trying to quell this insurgency. But without proper preparations for combat, their troops soon found themselves outmatched. Many Russian soldiers were still dressed in ceremonial outfits unfit for combat, and their existing tactics were simply not effective enough against their enemy's new armaments, which they severely lacked intel on. Most of their garrison were blown to bits during the initial assault on the parade, and reinforcements from the other bases are still miles away, with their escorts either dead or dying. The panicked Doppler M drivers dispersed in an attempt to flee from the chaos, but all were swiftly captured by incoming Psi Corps forces. The defense efforts soon crumbled, and Epsilon soldiers entered the now stranded High Command Heart building, slaughtering every last one of the officers within, their sorry existence no longer necessary in Yuri's new dominion. One miscalculation had occurred during all this, however. Premier Romanov had somehow survived the initial attack on the parade, and has retreated into the safety of the new Iron Guard defenses inside the Kremlin. Seeing no other way out, Romanov decided to evacuate using an X-MiG and its Fulton surface-to-air recovery system. The Black Guards held down the Kremlin's surroundings, fiercely repelling the incoming Epsilon forces as they stalled for the jet's arrival. Commendable though their bravery may be, they too foolishly failed to account for the possibility of subterranean attacks. A strike team emerged from within the perimeter, led directly by Malver. Distracted by this sudden attack, the interior guards failed to notice the shadowy figure darting past them. Moments later, the bothersome premier's life was ended in a single slash. A psychic beacon was then erected, and summarily took control of the remaining Russians. As Yuri re-emerged in Moscow, the main Scorpion Cell forces began stirring as well, for this operation was only a small part of their grand entrance. Various branches of the Epsilon army came out of hiding, launching multiple assaults simultaneously across the globe. Spearheading the offensive in North Africa is the attack on the coastal city of Casablanca, Morocco, the largest Confederation base on the continent. Utilizing the city's underground infrastructures, the cell was able to bring the effectiveness of their renowned hit-and-run tactics to an even greater height. Surprised but not deterred, the Confederation believed they would eventually overpower the terrorists, but they were dumbfounded when the nearby US forces seemingly started to assist the cell in its attacks. Unbeknownst to both them and the Americans, a psychic beacon had been hidden inside a statue next to the nearby American base, and its accelerated activation has placed the soldiers under the command of the Epsilon army. Finally grasping the severity of the uprising, the Confederate forces tried to call for backup from Spain, only to find their radar domes had already been infiltrated during the skirmishes. Any hopes of escaping by sea were dashed shortly after, for their naval port was likewise sabotaged in advance. The nuclear reactors powering the base were quickly taken out by the shadow tanks as well. Stranded and without hope, the remaining Confederation troops were soon routed, their deaths heralding the Scorpions' rise as their last mark on history. Meanwhile, far west in the renamed city of Stalingrad, the Soviet general, along with Colonel Krukov and Reznov, are facing complications of their own. Oblivious to the Epsilon attacks in other parts of the world, the trio are instead embroiled in a defensive battle against a major operation instigated by the US General Ben Carville. The rebels had seized one of the communications outposts earlier in the day, allowing them to catch the Soviets off guard. Although overwhelmed initially, the Soviet general managed to slow down the rebels significantly thanks to advancements in Tesla technologies in the past 2 years. Once the reinforcement from the Richmond garrison arrives, the American insurgency will be crushed in no time, and
Good to see inside your mind, General.
chaos has been unleashed upon the world, and the mental Omega War is now in full swing. Their preparations in the last 2 years proved fruitful, as the Epsilon army, with its unorthodox weapons, has seized much of the world in the blink of an eye. Even before being struck, the Russian Dominion was already starting to show signs of its weakening hold. But no one, not even themselves, anticipated how blindingly fast their empire had toppled. Having stolen and perfected the unfinished stealth technology from the Kanegawa Industries, Yuri's shadow tanks had utilized their element of surprise to its fullest potential. The Russian military command chain quickly collapsed with the fall of Moscow, and their global communications channels were sabotaged altogether, allowing Epsilon's forces to systematically divide and conquer the survivors. The Russians occupying the American continent fared no better, as even the renowned Soviet general had fallen prey to this new threat. Far too focused on the Allied rebels, the general failed to notice any irregularities with their reinforcements approaching from Richmond. These forces had already fallen under the influence of Epsilon's mind control tricks, and were sent here to topple the Union's reign in America. The Soviet general's talents, in particular, are highly regarded by Yuri, and he wished not to simply eliminate them like he did to the High Command, but to instead bend their mind to his service. Before the general could sense any abnormalities, Yuri used the beacon as an intermediary and personally unleashed a psychic attack on the Soviet general, who succumbed quickly to the attack. With their commander incapacitated, the Stalinton garrison fell shortly after to Epsilon forces, subjugated by a psychic beacon erected on the ruins of the Pentagon. The Soviet positions in Africa and the Middle East weren't spared either, as the Scorpion Cell forces easily blitzed through them in a matter of days, removing these filthy foreign occupiers once and for all from their lands. While the Comintern became complacent in the last 2 years, the Scorpion Cell had been orchestrating plans to ensure their enemy's downfall. Now, with their re-emergence alongside the Epsilon army, the Cell has finally achieved one of their foundational objectives. Massive redeployment operations began across the remaining Soviet states in order to combat this worldwide uprising. But with nearly all of their top commanders KIA and their still burgeoning satellite network dead in the water, Soviet Russia is now but a heap of sand, powerless against Yuri's forces. Uncontested deployment of enhanced psychic beacons began en masse, leaving many production sites and industrial plants unscathed as Epsilon assumed control of them. With their improved leash range and activation speed, many hastily formed defense lines crumbled easily under their psychic assault. Amidst the pandemonium, these abnormal signals were noticed by the Allies in the UK, who took this chance to set up a rescue operation for Special Agent Tanya, whom they recently discovered is being held in the Soviet-converted fortress of Warszawa, Poland. Utilizing his newly developed prototype Chrono backpack, Siegfried teleported himself into the fortress and helped Tanya escape through the Wisła River. Since the make-believe Midas warheads are now in Yuri's hands, the PRC took advantage of the discord and launched an invasion into Central Asia. Between the narrow mountains and the rugged roads, their sluggish Nuwa columns had suffered greatly during their conflict with the Russians 2 years ago. An upgrade was proposed, and with these new armadillos, an improved version of the standard Soviet Barillo, the Chinese were able to conquer the entirety of Central Asia in one fell swoop. The Latin Confederation similarly made moves during this time, seemingly preparing a power play of their own to assume control of the Western European theater. Such lofty goals are not easily achieved, but the Confederation is surprisingly hopeful. The source of their confidence lies with their last cloning facilities in Zaragoza, sneakily constructed in the last war when they briefly gained access to Psychor tech during the coordinated assaults on Euro facilities. Yuri is determined to remove this last vestige of his creations from the Soviet arsenal, but he also sees it as an opportunity for growth. Rather than be destroyed, the cloning facilities will serve as the perfect stage to showcase Epsilon's latest advancements in genetic manipulation tech, the Terra Nova virus, a deadly agent researched on the physically capable prisoners of Alcatraz Island. A prison camp was set up near the cloning facilities, which housed prisoners both mentally and physically capable, soldiers whom the Confederation hoped to clone. Among these prisoners is a seasoned veteran, who is being sent into one of the cloning vats just as an Epsilon infiltrator arrived. Posing as a prisoner of war, the infiltrator quickly changed his disguise and snuck into one of the cloning vats, carrying with him several vials of the Terra Nova virus.
Comrade?
The vat suddenly malfunctioned, its delicate cloning sequence going haywire due to the insertion of the Terra Nova virus. Hulking humans with mutated muscle mass emerged from the vats, aggressively attacking any and all Confederation forces in their sight. The guards frantically fired back, but these brutes shrugged the bullets off like they weren't even affected, and tore the panicked soldiers into pieces with their bare hands. Confederation tanks joined the fray, but their shells were similarly futile against the brutes. Alarms were sounded in the base, and the Confederation scrambled to suppress the near-endless amount of brutes pouring out from the vats. One of the brutes, however, seemed different from the others. One of them was different. The aforementioned veteran, whose genetic makeup had an unusual compatibility with the Terra Nova virus, beyond the expected thresholds of a regular human. Such extraordinary bonding resulted in the creation of a bloodthirsty soldier, who not only obtained an enhanced physique, but also inherited the intelligence and tactical sensibilities from his previous life. A superhuman, in the truest sense of the word. The veteran, now known as Ron, welcomed his rebirth, as well as his new role in Yuri's ranks. Satisfied with the outcome of the suitable specimen they had scouted earlier, the infiltrator bestowed an experimental energy weapon upon the super soldier, who fired it at the terrified Confederation troops near him. Infused with Terra Nova mutation particles, the weapon's attack brutally and spontaneously transformed its victims into more mindless brutes, loyal to Epsilon. The tide of flesh soon overpowered the defenders and spread their rampage into the city as well. Numerous Confederation forces rushed to the scene to try to control the situation, with several vultures heading straight for the vats. The archers brought here using drillers, however, blasted them to bits before they could accomplish anything. The remaining Latinos fought on bravely, but nothing they did changed the outcome. Their conventional tactics simply lose all meaning in the face of overwhelming might. And it did not take long before Zaragoza succumbed to the products of Epsilon's insidious research. With the addition of Ron to Epsilon's arsenal and legions of brutes at their command as well, the fall of Europe is now but a matter of time.
Comrade General,
Good to hear from you.
let's go.
Contrary to what Yuri believed, the Soviet general wasn't the only one capable of resisting the psychic beacon's mind control waves in Stalinton. The two formidable Soviet colonels Krukov and Reznov possessed equal levels of mental fortitude and refused to buckle during the hostile takeover. The duo began seeking out nearby soldiers who were still trying to resist the beacon's influence, stealing their resolves as well. Together, they formed a strike team, conducting a daring rescue op on the Soviet general. While most facilities had been seized by the mind-controlled forces, the rescue team still managed to secure an airbase for themselves. With more firepower at their disposal, the two colonels successfully cleared the path free of anti-air defenses. The Soviet general swiftly departed on a command airship and was eventually delivered into the safe hands of their reinforcements, this time free of mind-control shenanigans. The two colonels, however, remained in Stalinton with their fellow comrades, deciding to continue the fight in the Soviet states of America for the time being. There might be more soldiers out there who are still resisting, and Yuri will not be allowed to have his way with the SSA yet. As much as the Soviet general wanted to join them, they ultimately bid the two farewell upon hearing the lieutenant's pleas. Disaster had befallen the rest of the world as well, and the general's skills are indispensable if the Soviets are to recover from the current state of affairs. The capital is lost, the premier is dead, and the entire high command in Moscow has perished. The Confederation is thrown into disarray in a similar fashion too, as Yuri has been targeting many key operatives and leaders in their ranks, crippling their command structure, and not to mention the destruction of their Spanish headquarters. The Soviet forces in Europe and the American continents are doing the best they can, but it's an uphill battle at best. Elsewhere, however, Yuri has already begun constructing an untold amount of psychic beacons and amplifiers, capturing the minds of millions, including many of the Union's best soldiers. Desperate times call for desperate measures, so what remains of the Confederation and Soviet Russia have temporarily formed a new chain of command to facilitate troop deployment and information exchange. The venerated Soviet general is naturally included as part of this joint command chain, and has immediately set sail for Rio de Janeiro, where they picked up a distress signal from Morales. According to his report, the seasoned sniper had been active in South America for the past months, looking into his suspicion of the enemy establishing a foothold there. The assassination of Boris had gotten to his head since the last war, and he'd been looking into every possible lead that could help him find those who murdered his brother in arms. He eventually tracked down some Epsilon forces to Rio de Janeiro and witnessed bizarre genetic experiments being conducted on the local populace. The infiltration did not last long before Morales was discovered though, as Yuri was likewise looking for the colonel, a skilled soldier of high importance, and his Epsilon forces cornered him before he realized in time, hence the distress signal. An emergency task force was dispatched to the area as quickly as possible, which included an MCV, allowing the Soviet general to quickly establish a defense perimeter around Morales. The plan is to evacuate the colonel using their X-MiG and Fulton surface-to-air recovery system, similar to the extraction method attempted on Premier Romanov, and after that, eradicate the Epsilon forces in the area. Trouble is, however, that contrary to Morales' report, the nearby Epsilon forces turned out to be more than a mere outpost. Though seemingly nothing special at a glance, the general quickly spotted several unidentified structures within the Epsilon bases. Various units phased in and out of vision when moving near these never-before-seen devices, leading the general to suspect that they have the ability to conceal nearby forces. This alone already makes the bases quite troublesome to take down, but numerous cloning vats were also spotted in the area, far more than the Soviets expected. Not only that, but it seems the vats are experimenting with cloning soldiers with higher levels of combat dexterity as well, as several viruses quickly approached Morales' position. According to past intel, these elite female snipers are part of the Scorpion Cell leader's personal guards, and should be extremely limited in number. The fact that they appeared here implies that Yuri has advanced far enough in his genetic manipulation project that he is now able to clone soldiers with superhuman marksmanship. Worrying news indeed, as the task force sent to retrieve Morales was nowhere near prepared enough to deal with such a massive clone army, and now a large portion of their already limited forces is now in jeopardy. Had anyone other than the Soviet general been assigned to this mission, the task force would have been as good as dead. But that's exactly where the difference lies. With the general's sound tactics, as well as these new sensor towers designed to counter Yuri's psychic illusion tech, the task force managed to stall long enough until aid arrived. The colonel was soon evacuated, and the general turned their attention towards the Epsilon bases. To ensure the destruction of their enemies, the general was provided several Kirovs, as well as a tactical nuke. With more ordnance at their disposal, the general was able to brute force their way through most of the Epsilon bases. When they approached the one containing the majority of the cloning vats, however, a nuclear explosion was suddenly triggered within the base, the source of which seemingly originating from a biotank of unknown contents. The exact reason behind this incident is unclear, but the Soviets give little thought to it before they leveled the last Epsilon position. With Morales now in safe hands, and the Epsilon forces in Hugenero eliminated, the Soviet general used the opportunity to reassess the situation. All other things aside, the most glaring issue at the moment is the surprisingly high level of Epsilon activities in South America. It wasn't that the general wasn't aware of the Epsilon presence on the continent, but to this degree, most certainly not. The task force would have been routed if it wasn't for the Soviet general, and they're still unsure if Morales had buried the lead intentionally regarding their enemies. If the Epsilon army had already created such entrenched positions in populated cities like these, then who knows how many more of them are crawling over the rural regions. One thing is certain though, their enemies have not been idling about in the last 2 years. Then there's the incident with the biotank. The explosion's blast radius wasn't anything to be scoffed at, and the general's lieutenants inferred that Yuri already has access to several of the Union's nuclear warheads. It is weird that they would make as crass of a mistake as misfiring a nuke on their own base though, so it's more likely that they didn't want the Soviets to capture and study what was inside the tank. In his debriefing, Morales mentioned that the biotank contained a female psychic who had been experimented on for weeks, and that the facility's personnel kept saying they missed the deadline, and that Yuri would not be pleased with them. These two things are clearly related, but with the biotank destroyed, they have no choice but to let go of this mystery. With how things are stacking up, it is clear to the Soviets that the situation has already spiraled out of control in South America. This small victory in Hugenero could barely sway the outlook on the war here, not to mention the considerable portion of Confederation troops mind-controlled by Yuri's psychic beacons. It was clear that there would be no point clinging onto the few positions they still held on the continent, and the Confederation decided to evacuate as many forces as they could, rallying to the Soviet general as they collectively moved up north. If the reports they had just received from Krukov and Reznov are indeed true, then the Union will have need of these soldiers elsewhere.